Good morning to everyone who's joined us on Zoom. We will hang on just a couple more moments. We've got a couple more people coming to join us here in the recital hall, and then we'll get started. Thank you. Okay, I think we're going to get started because it's 8:45. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today, whether you're joining us on Zoom at home or whether you're here live at school for my personal first workshop back in person. It's very exciting. It's been a long time coming. For the last couple of years, we have been doing our Zooms, our parent workshops on Zoom, as you know. So thank you very much for those parents who've joined us in person today. It's very exciting to see you and to be able to do this back in school again. So our parent workshop today, as you know, is focused on bilingualism and how we in the lower schools, that's early years and pre-prep, how we have changed and adapted our approach to bilingualism slightly over the last couple of years. And we're going to explain a little bit more about bilingualism itself, what we interpret it to be, and what we're doing at school, as well as what you can do at home to optimize bilingualism for your students, for our students, for your children. So I'm just going to start by sharing my screen. So a slight caveat to start with, as I said, obviously, this is all about optimizing bilingualism. And bilingualism is a field of research that is enormous. It's something that's growing. It's a huge focus for a lot of educational research at the moment, as our communities and as our world is becoming more diverse and more international communities are developing. It's been something that a lot of educationists have focused on over the last few years, really optimizing bilingualism in schools. And as with any case where you have a growing and developing subject or topic of research, there are researchers that agree with each other and there are researchers that disagree with each other. So it's quite a diverse field. And as with most of if you're familiar with academic work and academic reading, there will always be one body of researchers that will argue something and another body of researchers that find evidence to contradict that. So it is a diverse area of research, and it's something that is growing and enormous, but something that is very important to us. And this is sort of our take on it, and based on the evidence and the research that we have found that matches our context, because obviously with all these things, it's very important that we're ensuring we provide what is suitable for our body of students, and that will be very different to schools in other countries or communities in other places. So we will talk a little bit this morning about what we mean by bilingualism. I will talk through some common misconceptions and also why bilingualism is so important. We'll then talk about what we're doing at school, and again, things that you can do at home to support with developing optimal bilingualism. So I talk about optimal bilingualism because actually in the past, people would say, are you bilingual? Well, how can you classify whether somebody is bilingual or not? What is that level where they go from not being bilingual to being bilingual? And actually, that's not something that we believe in. We believe that actually bilingualism is a continuum. It changes and it develops and it increases. So when I talk about optimizing bilingualism, I talk about making sure that our students are proficient in it, that they have a good level of bilingualism and a good understanding of multiple levels and depths of both of their or all of their languages, if they happen to have 2, 3, 4 languages that they are learning. So making sure we're optimizing it, because I could easily say, oh, I'm bilingual, I speak English, I speak Thai. I have very little Thai. I would not say that my Thai is optimized. It's certainly not going to, get me through a conversation at an academic level or a conversation in a workplace. I might be able to direct a taxi, but that's about my level of Thai. So I would be quite far down on the continuum of bilingualism, but we want our students to be up at the top. We want them to be proficient and to have that really good level of both their Thai language and their English language and their Chinese language and any other languages that they're learning. So optimizing it. So rather than saying, are you bilingual? How bilingual are you? So it's on that continuum. There's two different types of bilingualism and bilingual development. So we talk about simultaneous bilingualism, which is when both languages are present from the onset of speech and both required simultaneously at the same time. So that might be in a household where we've got mummy who's speaking Thai or English, daddy who's speaking Chinese or German. Any families where we've got two parents, or it could be a parent and a nanny, anyone who's really involved in that child's daily life in a close way and speaking to that child in those languages right from the onset of their language at 18 months, 2 years old. So they start speaking both languages simultaneously, and they are acquiring and being exposed to both languages throughout their language development. So they continue to develop both languages simultaneously. We also talk about successive or sequential bilingualism. So successive or sequential bilingualism would be when a child starts to speak acquire their language and just a single language. So typically for our community, it would be their child would be learning Thai as their first language, and they would be then coming to school at perhaps pre-nursery or nursery age. They have some Thai already. They have that basis of Thai language that they've acquired from 18 months to 1 to 2 years old, and then they learn English slightly later on. So they're not quite simultaneous. We have one language, and then the second language is added on at some stage after the first language has begun to develop. Obviously, when children are learning a language, they don't go from nothing to being completely proficient in their language, within a couple of days or even a couple of months. It takes years and years. So language is continually developing. I think researchers believe that up until about the age of 8 is when children are really picking up that language, developing their vocabulary, their depth of understanding when it comes to kind of that higher order thinking in a language, which we'll come to that in a moment later on. So simultaneous bilingualism and successive or sequential bilingualism are two types of bilingualism. Now, there isn't really either. So a lot of people might say that actually simultaneous bilingualism is better than sequential bilingualism. There's a lot of research out there that says, yes, that it is great to optimize that language development as soon as children are ready to acquire language, expose them to those two languages. But that's not to say that if that's not an option in your household, if you don't have a multilingual household, that actually you're doing your child a disservice by them becoming sequential bilinguals. Actually, they get to the same point in the end. It might be slightly easier if they're learning both languages simultaneously. If that's an option, that's great. However, don't feel that it's a problem, or that actually your child will end up being less bilingual if that's not an option in your household, because for many households, that's just not the case. But if that is an option, that's great. There's also a lot of research out there that says if you do have a multilingual or bilingual household, it helps children to acquire language. Again, it only helps them. It doesn't stop it or ensure it happens. It helps if children are able to separate their languages by either person or context. So if you are a bilingual household, it can make it easier for children if they know that one parent will speak to them in one language and the other parent will speak to them in another language. It's just a helpful way for them to sort it for themselves and acquire those languages. Again, if that's not the case, it's not a problem. It's not going to stop them from picking up both languages. It's just a way to make it slightly easier, or slightly, I say quicker, it's not quicker, slightly easier for the child if they're able to separate that by person. And then by context, obviously, would be perhaps speaking one language, their home language at home, and then speaking English at school, to be able to separate that context for them as well. But again, as I said, there is a lot of research out there. Some of it contradicts each other, some of it supports each other. And it's really about optimizing rather than preventing or ensuring. It's just the best way to kind of make it as easy as possible for children. So we can also talk about early successive bilinguals and late successive bilinguals. So the brain of a baby or a young infant is absolutely primed to learn. They create neural connections faster, more rapidly. Their brain is more elastic. They're able to learn quicker because at that age, they are learning so much. They're learning physical development, they're learning language development, they're learning social skills, they're learning everything, and their brain is primed for that. So yes, there is an argument out there that actually that an early successive bilingual is someone who learns that language early in their childhood. Some researchers say that before the age of 6, they would be classified as an early successive bilingual. And then once a child is 6 or 7 or older, their brain is adapting and it's starting to be less elastic. It's still elastic. Children are continually learning. As adults, we can become bilingual. I can go from monolingual to bilingual at my age. It's possible. It's just easier when children have that elasticity in their brain. So early successive bilinguals versus late successive bilinguals. However, the brain, yes, I said that the brain does maintain that elasticity, and even as an adult, it is possible to optimize bilingualism and become fluent in another language. It's not possible. So, one of the common misconceptions that is out there is that we need to teach children one language at a time. And as you know, as I said, that's simply not true. If we think about Chomsky, so Chomsky was a child development theorist in around the 1960s. So we're talking quite a long time ago, but he's a classic theorist with a lot of really valuable theories. If we think about his research, and it's backed by a lot of recent research as well, so it's not contradicted, but it's backed by a lot of recent research, he believed that there is a biological basis to language. So we as humans, we grow up ready to acquire language. A sort of, like I mentioned earlier, about the brain being primed, the brain being elastic at that young age to give us what we need. It's an innate kind of biological need that we have to pick up language to be able to communicate, to be able to ask for things, to communicate our needs, to be able to build relationships, which are all core to our human being. So children have an innate ability to learn language, but also something that he picked up, which was really interesting, is that a lot of children, regardless of the language they're learning, make the same or similar grammatical mistakes regardless of the language they're learning. So a child who's learning English might make similar grammatical mistakes while acquiring language as a child who's learning Thai, or a child who's learning Spanish, or a child who's learning any other language. That there seems to be this universal grammar he talks about, a universal grammar, which are these language structures in a child's brain that they develop as they grow and as they acquire language. So he talks about this universal grammar, which actually supports something that I'm going to talk about later. So I just want to bear in mind the universal grammar that Chomsky talks about. So he talks about the fact that some languages seem to share the same rules. And the fact that it's an innate need and that we don't need to teach it. Children don't need to be taught language. They acquire it, they assimilate it. It's a natural thing that babies and young children do. Piaget, who is another educational theorist from previous to Chomsky, even longer ago, the early 1900s, 1920s, he talks again about that word assimilation, that language needs to be added to these structures. So he talks about schemas. I'm not sure whether any of you have been to any of the sessions that we've run in early years before about schemas, which are natural structures that children develop through exploring and playing. They explore. I was in a Lion Cubs classroom yesterday, and one of the children was spinning. They were spinning a disc like that. They were spinning it and they were watching it move around. And then he moved to a different part of the classroom and found a different object, and he began spinning that to see how actually this moves like that. If I go over there, oh, I can turn, but this is a different shape. And they're beginning to make those kind of connections in their brain and build these schemas. He then began spinning himself and to see how, whether he could turn in circles. So we would call that an encircling schema. He was exploring how one thing can be adapted in different situations. And Piaget talks about children developing language schemas. So they're building these structures in their brain that language is then added onto. And that actually, while children are developing these physical schemas, they're also developing and acquiring language schemas, which we then add language onto later on. And we have to provide that exposure to that language, but that they will develop those schemas naturally. And we as adults and in the environment and through our interactions, our job is just to provide that language through our conversations for them to attach onto the schemas. They don't have to be taught it, it's something they do naturally. And then Vygotsky, who was a further child development theorist, again from a similar time to Piaget around the 1920s, he talks about social learning. And he talks about the zone of proximal development, which is like our optimum state for acquiring language and state for learning new things. And he talks about the importance of the social situation for children to be in that zone of proximal development in order to be able to acquire language. So the importance of social interactions when children are acquiring language, and how valuable it is that they are able to socially interact in a language of their choice to be able to do that. So just to sort of sum all of those things up, we need to expose children to dual language input. We don't have to teach it, we just expose them to that language. Early childhood brains are wired to acquire language, and that children don't need to be corrected. This is a really important thing. If a child is speaking to you in English or in any language, their home language, whatever language they're speaking to you in, and they make a grammatical mistake, or they don't add a plural on the end and it needs to be a plural, or it could be anything like that, they don't need it to be corrected. They just need it modeled back to them accurately, because that will be a way that you're exposing them to accurate language without knocking their confidence and making them feel like they've done something wrong or they've made a mistake. Because we know that children who get told they've made a mistake or they've done something wrong, they shut down. They don't want to do it. They want, you know, if they feel they've made a mistake, then it can sometimes have an adverse effect and they decide to stop talking altogether. So it's actually better just to model back accurately. So if a child comes up and says, I go shopping yesterday. Oh, amazing, you went shopping yesterday. So you're just modeling it back accurately. That will be the best way to optimize their development without knocking the progress and the confidence. So learning a new language becomes more difficult the more languages you know. Actually, no, that's not true. In fact, learning a new language becomes easier rather than more difficult for bilingual children. And bilingual children enjoy cognitive advantages, which I'll come to in a moment, and actually perform better in learning additional languages. I think there's a misconception that the brain has a capacity, and that actually once a child has one language, it's going to be really difficult for them to be able to add another language in because the brain gets full. That's not true at all. Children actually have the capacity to have multi-languages in there. And as we talk about those schemas and those kind of language structures, that actually once those are developed, if you think about the universal grammar, they're building those kind of basic foundations there of language. You can hook different languages onto those structures and that understanding, and actually acquiring a second language is much easier because they've already got that in place from their first language, from their home language. However, as we've said before, it is true that acquiring additional languages is easier for younger children because their brain is more malleable, it's more plastic, elastic. They're rapidly developing those neural connections quicker than older children or adults. And I suppose it's just a bit more a bit more, a younger child is less likely to have multiple languages. So it might be the assumption that actually, if you're acquiring it as an older person or as an older child with a second language, it could be trickier, but that's simply not the case. So why? Oh, I think I missed the slide. There we go. So a third kind of misconception is that bilingual children develop more slowly in their monolingual counterparts than their monolingual counterparts. So that children who have two languages actually develop their languages slower, but also develop their other areas of learning slower. So their mathematical understanding or their physical development could be impacted. Again, this I think goes back to the misconception that the brain has a capacity, and that actually if you have two languages, it's going to kind of reach capacity. I know sometimes as adults, I certainly feel like my brain sometimes has capacity, and when it gets full, things fall out the side and they do just get missed. They get forgotten because I'm at capacity. I think that's something definitely for adults. I think it's very different though when it comes to learning and when it comes to children, that bilingual children develop more slowly. It's just not true. In fact, it has a positive impact on many things. Bilingual children develop at similar rates, and they might show delay or they might show acceleration compared to monolingual children. It's not related to bilingualism. It's not related to that side of things. Children develop at different rates. As we know, every child is different. Every area of their learning is different. Every area of development is different. They've all got strengths. They've got things they find more challenging. That's what makes us all unique. And so I can reassure you that encouraging and optimizing bilingualism in your children will have no negative impact on any other area of their development or their learning. It just won't. So why is it important? So it's important for multiple reasons: academic reasons, educational reasons, as well as some sort of social emotional reasons, which we'll come to in a moment. But being bilingual encourages children to have greater mental flexibility. And by mental flexibility, I mean things like being able to change my opinions based on evidence that I've been given. So I've got a fixed opinion on this. Somebody comes and says, actually, have you considered this? Oh, I've got the flexibility to be able to change my mind and take on board that evidence and show that flexibility in my thinking. As well as things like being able to change a plan. If I'm doing an activity and I look at this isn't working, how can I change this? The ability, the mental flexibility to be able to go, okay, I'm going to take on board that evaluation, that reflection. I'm going to change my plan. I'm going to do it this way instead. That's mental flexibility. So being able to do those sorts of things, as well as changing focus. So being able to focus on one activity and then being able to shift my focus to another activity. Those types of examples would be examples of mental flexibility. Also, sensitivity to language. We've already talked about that. Once you've got a language, you've got those structures in place. It's easier to acquire that second language. Metalinguistic awareness is when I was talking about that kind of higher level of language. So being able to kind of read inference in something. So kind of reading between the lines, I'd sort of explain it as being able to understand those nuances from language when somebody says something in a slightly different way, but you can tell you've got that understanding of the language to realize they might not mean exactly what they're saying. Kind of that level of language, the metalinguistic awareness of things. Children who are bilingual or have that higher level of bilingualism show greater creativity, and also, as I said, that mental flexibility allows them to be able to zone out, be able to channel their focus, as well as switching between focus. It enables them to kind of ignore distracting information a little bit more and focus on objectives. So there's a lot of academic positives when it comes to optimizing bilingualism. This is why it's really important. However, it's also important for lots of other reasons. So and this is something that I'm really passionate about, and something that I feel wholeheartedly for, is that language has such strong links to national identity and cultural identity. And it's really important. As an international child growing up myself, I grew up in Hong Kong, and then I was living in Indonesia, and then I was in England, now I'm in Thailand. My language is English 100%, but actually it's quite difficult sometimes to kind of identify where I feel I lie in terms of cultural identity and that side of things. So it's really important for our children, considering how much the universe in terms of international travel and communities is exploding, and that's fantastic. It's so important, so valuable, that the awareness and diversity and everything is brilliant, but it's still really important for our children to grow up with a sense of cultural identity and national identity. And there is huge links between that and language as well. So linked to being bilingual and having that home language, despite coming to an international school and being surrounded by English as the common language at Harrow, we must value their home language as well. And we must be doing that at home and at school, so that they can really establish and have that sense of place in the world, knowing where they are and where their community is. That leads to greater well-being. And further on from that, you know, thinking to the future, we don't know where any of our students, your children, will be working or living in 15, 20 years' time. They may well be living or working back in Bangkok, working for a multinational company and conversing and working in Thai as their home language, as their corporate language. And so therefore it's really important for us to ensure that we're not doing them a disservice by not ensuring their Thai language is as optimal as the English language that we are teaching them at school. So the future is a huge part of it as well. So what we're doing at school, please be reassured, English is very much our common language still at school. We are a British curriculum school, that's not changed. English is still our common language, but we are making sure that we recognize and value all languages. Every language is valued as equal and celebrated. All of our lessons are still and always will be delivered in English, because that is our language, our common language of our school, and all of our outcomes, so written outcomes or spoken outcomes in terms of presentations, things like that, will all be done in English as well, because that is our school policy. There's no change to policy here. It is purely about ensuring that in our focus to optimize their English, we aren't neglecting optimizing their home language at the same time. So in lessons, all lessons will be delivered in English and outcomes will be in English, except obviously if they're in a Thai or another foreign language lesson. But where necessary, adults will be empowered and encouraged to translate. So allowing children to attach the English language onto those kind of existing structures that they've got, and providing new vocabulary in both English and Thai. Now, because we are providing those labels and English labels and attaching them onto existing Thai structures, we need to make sure that their Thai home language foundations are really strong to be able to attach them onto it. So the way that we do that, just sort of linking back to what Zygotsi was talking about social interactions, students and student to adult interactions, so that's a child talking to a member of staff or an adult at school, children will be empowered to initiate that interaction in the language or a combination of languages of their choice, because we just want our children to be confident in communicating. And it's very normal for children who are bilingual or multilingual to actually mix up a little bit of one language and a little bit of another language into a sentence, because they're the words they know and that's what they're confident in. And we certainly don't want to be saying no to that. We want to be encouraging that. We want to be supporting our students to use their entire linguistic repertoire is kind of the phrase that's used. We want them to be using all of their language. And again, similar to, as I mentioned earlier, modeling it back to them then in English or in Thai or depending on who it is that they have interacted with. And when in English, when that language has communication interaction has been initiated in a language that is not English, we will model it back so they're still getting that exposure to the accurate spoken English as well. It's quite interesting, actually, and I was having this conversation with a few different colleagues recently, that in early years, even in early years, you get very few children who will come and initiate an interaction with me in Thai. Some of them do, but not that many, because I think even from that very young age, they have a concept of who they can communicate and what languages with, communicate with in which languages. So I suppose when I talk about these student-adult interactions, it will typically be children interacting with our Thai staff in Thai and then modeling it back in English, because if a child came to me to speak to me in Thai, I would say, oh, you know, I'm really sorry, sweetheart, I don't understand. Can you try and say it in English? Or I would ask somebody to help me. So it when practicable and when actually, yeah, purposeful, that will be the situation. And with student-to-student interactions, again, just optimizing and the opportunities for them to use the language that they're comfortable in, because again, especially in early years, and if a child is new to pre-prep, and they come perhaps with less English than some of the other students, we want them to feel confident to communicate. We want them to feel that they are able to share their needs and have those needs met. That's really important for their well-being, and for their social development as well. However, there obviously is the caveat there that if a language is being used, if language, whatever language it is being used to exclude students, then that would become part of our behavior management policy, and we would deal with that appropriately if it was purposeful use of a language they knew that another child wasn't able to access. We would have to address that. Okay, so what you can do at home: modeling accurate language, high-level vocabulary, no baby speak. Please don't speak to children like they're babies, because if we're speaking to them like they're babies, that's the language they're exposed to, that's the language they're acquiring. So using proper language with them, whatever language it is, accurate grammar and, you know, accurate vocabulary. And there's no harm in using some high-level vocabulary as well in that, because if they're exposed to high-level vocabulary, that's the language that they will be learning, that's the words they will be learning, and that will help them to develop their vocabulary. You might need to explain the meaning of a word, or you might need to kind of give a simplified version alongside it, but never be worried about using that really kind of higher level vocabulary with children, because what we model is what they learn. So if we're modeling it accurately, that's what they're going to pick up. If we model that higher level vocabulary, that's what they're going to pick up. And it's easier for children who have strong foundations in their home language to acquire a second language. So don't feel that there is a huge pressure to speak lots of English at home. If you're not typically a bilingual household where you've got a parent speaking one language, another parent speaking another language, that's slightly different, because actually that's exposure to both of those languages, and that would be the simultaneous acquisition. But if that's not your situation at home, please don't feel that there's pressure to be teaching English from the very beginning. Allow them to get really strong foundations in their home language, because this will help them ultimately in the future to pick up the English that they'll be learning at school. Don't force your child to speak a particular language. Allow them to have that choice of language that they're confident in and that they're happy in. And that's similar to so the interactions that we'll be having at school. Whatever language they choose to interact in, that is the language that we will then respond in, or that, you know, we will respond in their in Thai or Chinese, whatever their home language is, if possible, and then follow on with the modeled English. So never force a child to speak a particular language or tell them not to speak a particular language. Allow them to build that for themselves. They don't correct their language. And just a caveat there, that exposure to any language helps all languages. So exposure to really getting those strong foundations in one language will help them in the future. There's no right or wrong in this. Nothing you will do will stop them acquiring a language, but what we do can help them to optimize that and make it as good as it can be. When we talk about exposure to language, I suppose something to be mindful of again is just whatever we expose them to is what they will learn. So if you're watching lots of YouTube, you're watching lots of Peppa Pig, that is the language that your children are learning. And if that's not what you want them to be learning, then just think carefully about what it is you're exposing them to ensure that they are absorbing and assimilating the correct language and the kind of proper language. Peppa Pig is great for many reasons. Children absolutely love Peppa Pig, but if you listen to it, it is absolutely terrible modeling of English. So yeah, just something to be aware of. I'm not saying don't watch Peppa Pig, but for me, it's not a good model of English. So just thinking about that, whatever you're exposing your child to will be what they are ultimately absorbing. Okay, so that is the end of our presentation. So I'll have a quick check of the time. Okay, so we've got some time now to ask questions. I think what I will do is perhaps if anyone live in school has any questions first, I'll sort of answer any questions in the recital hall first, and then I will come to anyone at home on Zoom. If you've got any questions, if you pop them into the chat, then I can answer those after I've answered any of the ones in school. Does anyone have any questions? Okay. We'll pass the microphone around so the people at home can hear the questions that are coming from the recital hall.
Hi,
Hello.
My child study in PNC,
Mm-hmm.
and one question is, my child love Peppa Pig so much, and if not Peppa Pig, what kind of the cartoon that you suggest that?
It's a tricky one. I think Peppa Pig is absolutely loved. I know though that a lot of the comments that we get is that children here are beginning, you know, they start to speak English with an American accent, and actually I know that a lot of parents want their child to speak it with an English accent, and I think a lot of that is due to watching American things on YouTube, because again that's what children are picking up. Having said that, there is Octonauts is a good one. Paw Patrol is a good one. Yeah, those sorts of things are good. Anything where the language is accurate is good. It's just with Peppa Pig, it's badly spoken grammar, and it's simplified, so it goes against what we're trying to encourage with modeling accurate kind of high level language. But I'm sure if you speak to Miss Caroline, she'll be able to suggest some good things for you to look at. No problem. Any other questions?
Hello.
Hello.
My child is at Little Lions.
Yes.
I have a question. So it seems nice to learn multi-language. I'm wondering how many languages that Haro will provide to our child. I know that you will teach Chinese, right?
So going back to what we were saying about the importance to kind of establish those foundation languages. So in early years, we have English instruction all the way through. Once children move into nursery, then they will begin their formal Thai lessons, where they begin to read and write and introduce kind of the phonics of Thai and those skills, and that carries on into reception. In reception, we offer home language Mandarin Chinese lessons, but for children who already have that home language, that they're using that language at home, because obviously children are all at very different stages. And then as children move into pre-prep, they again they begin to have MFL, Mandarin foreign language lessons as well, as a additional language too. Because you can imagine the complexity of our timetables and everything like that. It's just not feasible to, particularly in early years. It would be brilliant if we could have 3 different language teachers in each class, and that they're surrounded and they're able to assimilate that language that we sort of talked about without the direct instruction. But it's not feasible. So as they move into pre-prep, they begin to have instruction in a 3rd language.
And how about the other languages, like European language, like
I
Spanish?
believe that in year 6 they begin to have Thai lessons, French lessons, but that's the upper school curriculum. So I'm afraid I'm not sure about that. But as you know, as I said, kind of when we're acquiring these languages, it's really valuable. It's not only about being directly taught that language, and in those lessons, which are discrete lessons, a French lesson or a Mandarin lesson in pre-prep, they're being discreetly taught it. So I totally agree with you. It would be fantastic if we were able to have multilingual classrooms where 3 languages were going on at the same time. That's not feasible. So I would say the best thing to do is to focus on the languages that you've got at home, and then at school as well, it begins to build with the discrete teaching in nursery and then into pre-prep.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Any other questions from? No? Okay, I'm just gonna have a look on the chat. Okay, so what is my opinion regarding language delay and language impairment in dual language children such as mild dyslexia? Do you think those dyslexic children learn 2 languages? So dyslexia is typically more linked to reading and writing. So it's not necessarily linked to spoken language. I mean, I think in some cases it can be, but typically we would see it presented more in reading and writing. So I would say that in terms of a child who has a diagnosis, again, the importance is that we're not assigning labels or diagnosis to children unless they've been medically, or somebody with clinical experience has actually diagnosed dyslexia. But I would say that if a child has had a diagnosis of dyslexia, there is still no reason why they would not be able to optimize their bilingualism. I can't see that there would be an issue with that, but I'm not an expert on bilingual, on dyslexia, so I'm not entirely sure about that one. But in my opinion, I don't believe that should be a reason why you don't focus on optimizing their bilingualism. If we want to speak Thai only at home, that's, yeah, absolutely. If that is, as I said at the beginning, that is absolutely fine. If that is what your household is, if your household is a Thai speaking household, and that is anyone who lives in there, that is their home language, their primary language, that's absolutely fine. You don't feel forced to speak English at home if that's not what your home naturally is. So that is absolutely fine. That's fine for them to develop that really strong foundation, really strong structure of their home language, which happens in your case to be Thai at home. And then when they come to school, they will acquire the English language better if they've got that really strong foundation of Thai. So that's absolutely fine. My child is in PNA, just wondering how school is going to assess the student regarding their progress in English, whether it's good enough for their current stage. So in early years, our teachers are continually observing and assessing students' development across the whole curriculum, whether it be their language development, their physical development, their numeracy, their number skills, their understanding of the world. So those assessments are going on continually. However, we do have what we call data points, where our teachers are all regularly then inputting their assessments onto a tracking program which we use, which actually happens to be Tapestry, which you will all know. Our teachers use that and they put in their assessments of where children are in both their home language and at the moment, in both English, and at the moment we assess home language Thai and home language Chinese, because they're the two languages that we have appropriately trained staff to assess in. So we will be assessing their language development in both English and in either Thai or Chinese, if that's their home language. And then what we will do is we use that information to then have meetings within the year group's teams to see where children need a little bit more support with, whether or not they need any further challenge. If they're doing really well, how can we make sure we're optimizing that learning? So in terms of regarding their progress in English, that is tracked and it is monitored. And I can reassure you that if your teacher had any concerns with regards to progress or with regards to attainment, you would know about it. They would be having those conversations with you, and you would be aware of that. So if your teacher hasn't shared any concerns, then that means that they're happy with how things are going. Okay. If my son and my daughter move to Harrow in this term, year 2 and 3, do you think it's too late for them? This is a really tricky one, because I would always say the sooner the better. As I said at the beginning of the presentation, the research shows that the earlier children acquire a second language, the easier it is for them. So there's that side of it, that actually their brain is, until the age of 6 or 7, their brain is more malleable. They're able to acquire that language easier. However, it doesn't mean that they won't be able to get to the same point in terms of their language if they start later on. It might be harder in terms of acquiring it, and it also might be trickier in terms of the social development side, the social development side of it, because in pre-prep children do tend to communicate in English. That seems to be their preference. We're not going to say no if they're communicating in Thai or in another home language. However, that does tend to be, the culture is that in year 1 or year 2, children begin to naturally be more confident. They begin to communicate with English with each other at school, particularly in class, when they begin to learn that if I'm in this place, I speak this language. If I'm in this place, I speak this language. And that's just how children, that's just how they seem to learn, and what they seem to do. So I wouldn't say it's too late, because they will still, they will have to work harder, and they might need a bit of extra catch-up time, but they're not going to not get to the same language level eventually, I suppose, is my answer to that question. The sooner the better is always my answer. How do I do pre-prep? Prefer to speak in Thai at home? If they are preferring to speak in Thai at home, then I would allow them to speak in Thai at home, and I would be ensuring that their Thai language is as strong as it can be, because this will help them to then hook on the English once they feel confident and able to. If you're worried about slow or low English proficiency in the future, I would perhaps make sure that you've had that conversation with their class teacher, and to see how they're actually getting on in school, because it might just be that they see home as somewhere to speak Thai, and actually at school they are speaking English confidently and proficiently for their age, and it's not a problem. If the teacher has spoken to you and they are concerned about their level of English development, then there's lots of different things that we can be doing at school as well as at home but what we need to do is we need to focus on the confidence first. The confidence comes first, and then when they are confident and ready, as long as they've got that strong structure for their Thai, then they will pick up the English. So I would focus on the emotional and confidence side of it, and reassuring them that they can speak the language that they are confident to speak, so that you're not then ending up having a detrimental effect on them wanting to communicate in any language. I hope that helped. Student does not pass the assessment. Well, we don't really, I'm not sure what you mean by assessment. It's not really a pass or fail assessment. When I talk about assessment, I talk about just a teacher spending time observing and getting a really good feel for where the children in their class are at in terms of their learning and the development, and where they could do with a bit more support, or where they could do with being challenged further. So it's not a pass or fail assessment. And if we feel that through those observations we notice any concerns, then we will, if necessary, if it's felt appropriate, address those concerns with the parents and share those concerns. Or if we feel that actually it's not anything that is a big problem, it's just something that we can address in school, it's not a concern that is worth following on with parents, then we will just address that and do what we need to do to support the children. So there's lots of different things we do, but it's not really a pass or fail assessment. Studying online, I know it doesn't understand the teacher, but not understand what I do to help. I think from that, I would say that again, it's the confidence side of things. So building his confidence to share his concerns. Perhaps if he's not confident to share his concerns in English to the teacher, you could, I don't know whether his class TA is online with him. Perhaps you could encourage him to speak to his class TA in the language that he feels comfortable in, to be able to share those concerns, so that she's then able to reiterate and explain in Thai, but then she will also be able to model back in English, so he's not losing the opportunity to learn the English alongside as well. I totally agree, though, that online learning has been really challenging for exactly this, because the children are not being surrounded by the language. If you think about a normal classroom, children are surrounded by so much language coming from so many different places, and it's so easy to switch between languages and to offer that. And online has been really hard for that. So I totally understand where you're coming from with that, but perhaps encouraging him, if possible, to communicate his concerns to the teaching assistant in Thai if she's available, and then she'll be able to support with translating and also providing the English for him. Okay, well, I hope that was really helpful. I think that's the end of our questions. Anybody still in the recital hall, any further questions from those questions? Okay, well, thank you very much for coming this morning, everybody. It's been really nice to see you here in person. And thank you very much, everybody who's joined on Zoom as well. There's been quite a big group of us actually today, so that's been really beneficial. Any questions at all regarding any of this or anything, please always, you know where I am. I'm in the early years, so either pop to Miss Noy at the desk and ask if you could have a chat to me, or send me an email. That's no problem at all. And thank you very much once again for coming. Zoom, I think we're going to close the Zoom now, so thank you very much and have a lovely day, everybody.